Greetings, YouTube. Today I'm going to talk about the role-playing book, Fantasy Imperium. Pretty big tome here. Now, I saw this originally at a brick-and-mortar gaming store, and it was like $35, and I was thinking, I'm not going to spend $35 in a book that, while it looks relatively interesting, it was being advertised as a historical role-playing game with an emphasis on detailed combat. So I went home, checked on Amazon, I found a used copy for $8, shipping included. So that's what I went with. And it sat on my to-read pile for a while. I just didn't get a chance to get around to reading it. And when I finally did, my reaction to it made my wife seem very sad for me, because she's like, "You were so you seem disappointed. You were so looking forward to reading this." And I told her that I had to explain to her what the definition of the term RPG heartbreaker was, because that's what Fantasy Imperium is. All right, I'm going to explain why. First chapter, first introduction paragraph. I'm going to read it to you. Fantasy Imperium is an interactive storytelling game of historical fantasy. Unlike a role-playing game, an interactive storytelling game is a type of game where there is a heavy emphasis on telling a story as opposed to simply running an ongoing collaborative narrative. An ISG, short for interactive storyteller game, will use advanced storytelling techniques to create an entire story, often told in a single gaming session. An ISG will use a system of scripted scenes written by the storyteller to create the plot, while the characters will react to the events of the plot and direct how it will play out. Playing Fantasy Imperium is like playing the part of an actor in a story, also like playing a war game. The goal of the game is to complete the quest created by the storyteller. If the player dies, he loses the game, unless it was a heroic death. If the goal is completed, then all the surviving players win the game. Games typically take from 1 to 4 sessions to complete. This sounds like a role-playing game to me. But you know, role-playing games don't have winners and losers. So right off the bat, I was not really looking forward to this game. But I forged ahead. Next was the character creation system. Its percentile-based stats is a whole lot of derived information. I mean, it's very dense. But you know, it didn't sound horrible. So I kept moving along. I've seen systems that were as complex and it still functioned. Eventually, I got around to the combat procedure. Combat is conducted in rounds. Each round is equal to 2 seconds of time. Individuals may choose only one action each round. And then there is a description in steps of how you go about combat. This description is 19 steps long. 19. One less than 20. Now, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but a couple of things that stuck with me. If a person is attacked, they may immediately take their action to react to the attack. In this case, their initiative number is ignored. The person usually chooses a defense, such as a parry or dodge. Okay, that makes sense. If a person is attacked after taking an action, so you've already had your action, then you get attacked. The only available option is to abort his next round's action and dodge at a penalty of negative 25%. Next round, he must dodge. That doesn't fit the archetype of, say, a raging barbarian to me, which is part of a fantasy game. Heck, it's part of history. I don't like a mechanic that forces you into things. That bothers me. It also gets into the fact that each hit is at a different location of the body. Each type of wound has to be tracked separately. Armor is ablative, in the sense that each piece of armor can take damage separately, and you must track the amount of damage each piece of armor absorbs until it eventually blows through. Every weapon has a chance of breaking every time you swing it. More things to keep track of. More resource bookkeeping. I'm not a fan of this concept. Then we got to the movement. Now, this system also has fatigue, so you have to keep track of your fatigues. Every round you're fighting, you rack up fatigue points. Every round you move, you rack up fatigue points. That's right, if you walk while burdened, and you'll be burdened if you're in armor, you rack up 1 point of fatigue damage. In 2.5 minutes, you will have racked up enough fatigue damage to be exhausted, which means you collapse from walking in armor. Yet, a few paragraphs later, you are informed that you can recover fatigue points by resting. And, oddly, you can rest while walking. So they've created a mechanism that says fatigue points rack up as you walk in your armor. And then they say, well, not really. You're resting while walking, so that doesn't count. And every time I move in my armor, say I go from a walk to a jog to a run, those are distinct stages. So if I'm at a running rate and I want to stop running, I have to first step down to the jog state before I can stop finally. So apparently everyone in this world in armor functions like a riverboat barge. I was dumbfounded. It was at that point that I pretty much started skimming the book. I was overwhelmed by the complexity. It just seemed so nitpicking, so pedantic, I could not believe it. Now, one of the things that attracted me was the fact that it had weapons illustrations, and I like weapons illustrations. In fact, I make them as a hobby. But when I finally got around to looking at the weapons illustrations, I realized that, frankly, they weren't very good. But I looked at the weapons section. The weapons section is broken down in weapon types. Makes sense. They have a section called knives. There are 32 entries in knives. There are only 5 different types of knives mechanically, so they could technically have 5 knives to cover all the mechanical differences. All the others are variations in weight, name, and the era that they were introduced. It also introduces daggers as being a 9th century invention. A dagger is a double-edged knife, usually symmetrical, most often symmetrical in cross-section. I'm pretty sure that that design existed before humans did. Alright, so I began to really question the historical aspects of this game. Then I got to all the other weapons, and they're just like this. Long lists of the same weapons, with 3 or 4 different mechanical versions, and yet the same thing repeated over and over again. And there's an illustration of every single weapon in the game. And you're looking at them, and the weapon variations are so slight that only a weapons expert could tell the difference. They were so slight that I, who am as close as a layperson is ever going to get to a weapons expert, couldn't see the difference. Then you get to the armor, okay? And the armor makes the weapon stuff seem simple. It pales in comparison. There are 6+ pages of descriptions of helmets. Just helmets. I couldn't believe it. And the illustrations pan out the fact that they're all the same. The magic system is skill-based, which is fine, and it has an extremely European, Judeo-Christian, Abrahamic background. So using magic is summoning demons and devils, and it's all black magic, and you're tainting yourself, and you'll be hunted down and slain by the Inquisition if you do this, and that kind of an attitude. It wasn't historical fantasy as you know it, because if this stuff existed all along, the world would have been fundamentally different. So I was monumentally depressed by this game. I was disappointed. I don't think I completely wasted my money because it was a marvel to behold. But a game that has to present you with 6+ pages of helmets, which could have been condensed down into maybe 1. It just boggles my mind. Now, I didn't play this game. Maybe this is a wonderful game. Maybe it's the perfect thing that certain people want who want to keep track of endless levels of bookkeeping and make sure that their helmet has exactly the right configuration for their character. But I'm not that person. So maybe I'm the wrong person to read this book. Maybe I'm the wrong person to review it. But Fantasy Imperium was just one massive bit of insanity as far as I was concerned. I can't recommend this book, and whoever wrote it, if you're listening to this, I apologize, but it's a mess from beginning to end, and I just can't quite figure out how it ever saw publication.